Hello everybody, it's Kenneth from the archives here with another video where I dip into our collections and delve into Dundee's history. Today I'm going to be looking at a pair of maps of Dundee which are in the collection of the gentleman you see in the centre there, Peter Carmichael. Now you may well know Peter Carmichael was a very important figure in Dundee's textile industry, being manager of Baxter Brothers Dens Works and a real pioneer in the development of the textile industry. He was also a great philanthropist, a great writer, and a very interesting man who we are very fortunate to have the papers of. And it's one of our more fascinating collections, and we'll undoubtedly be talking more about some of its contents and his life in the future. But today, it's these particular items I want to focus on. So this is basically a map in two halves. This half, which we'll be looking at first, concentrates on the centre and centre to west area of Dundee. Now, it's almost certainly drawn from the Ordnance Survey of 1858, with slight modifications made in the early 1860s. It's really fascinating because Dundee has changed so much, although there are things you can still recognise. And what I'm going to do is zoom in on certain areas so we can look at some things in a little bit more detail. This is the area running north of Ward Road up Constitution Road. And this is important because this is a real snapshot of Dundee as it existed in this time, and a Dundee which doesn't entirely look the same today, because there's a lot of things we can see here obviously that have gone. The prison is a key example. But if you look just next to the prison, we see an important part of Dundee's industrial history, and that is the Dundee and Newtown Railway, which we can see running from its original terminus at Ward Road up the Bray through to where it would go through the Law at the Law Tunnel. Now, this, as I've said in previous videos, was not a terribly successful way to get trains from Dundee to the north. And within a few years, this branch had been closed and the railway had been routed through Lochee to join the station at Dundee West, although some goods traffic survived on this part of the line for a little bit longer than that. Just to its right, you see New Cemetery. Well, this is the New Howff, as it was sometimes called, also known as the Constitution Road Cemetery. It opened in 1836 and was effectively Dundee's main cemetery for the period going forward. However, in the 20th century, it had ceased to be used by the 1930s for burials, and the town council in the 1960s decided they wanted rid of it. Why? It was getting in the way of the proposed ring road, and they also felt a car park could be built on it. And this was what ultimately happened, and the remains were removed from the cemetery in an act that is still highly controversial to this day. Here we're focusing on another couple of things. On the left, the street plan is actually quite familiar, and we see some recognisable buildings. In the centre there, we've got what we now know as the High School of Dundee. We've got the original Howff, which thankfully has still survived just to the south. But there's one obvious thing about this section of map that doesn't quite gel with today, and that is that what we now know as Albert Square, where the McManus, originally the Albert Institute and Victoria Galleries, would be located, isn't there yet. There are other buildings on that site, and this site would be cleared and the Albert Institute would be opened here in 1867, expanding eventually into the McManus that we know today. I've chosen to highlight the bit on the right because this is another bit of Dundee that would change relatively soon after this map was done. Because obviously the Murray Gate is still there, but it's not there in the same format because the Murray Gate and the Sea Gate beside it were heavily altered as part of the works that followed the City Improvement Act of 1871. Now, one concern was to widen what was known as the narrows of the Murray Gate. This is where it entered the High Street. And you can see here just how narrow the Murray Gate was. You can also see the way the Sea Gate came in at Burn Head, and again a very narrow entrance, with the Trades Hall, which at that time was the Clydesdale Bank, at the eastern end of the high street. So this would all be changed. And also another major Dundee street is missing if you look, because Commercial Street at this point only went up to Burn Head. It would be ploughed through to create a new main route up to the Albert Square. Again, zooming out a bit, we get a nice idea of what the Dundee Docklands looked like. So we have the Earl Grey dock and the King William IV dock, both of which survived until they were filled in the 1960s to make way for the approaches to the Tay Road Bridge. They'd also by that time become really too small for modern shipping. You can also see what's marked there as the Victoria Royal Arch, which was the great entrance to the docks. Now again, the Royal Arch is a famous Lost Dundee structure. It was built in 1853 to commemorate the 1844 visit of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert to Dundee. It survived until 1964, when it was a victim again of the building of the Tay Road Bridge. You can also see some other noticeable Lost Dundee buildings. Off the High Street, we've got the Town House and the whole area behind that would go when the City Square and Caird Hall were built. You've got the Union Hall at the left end of the High Street. We can see the old Overgate. And down at the bottom left there, we can see a station. Now, this actually is the terminus of the Dundee and Perth Railway, what would become known as Dundee West Station. However, this is probably not the West Station you're familiar with, because this station was replaced. And the station that you'll know from various pictures, the really grand one, wasn't built until 1889-90, when it was opened by the Caledonian Railway. This is the map that goes to the east. And again, it's very interesting. I think one of the stark things is how little of what we now know as Eastern Dundee was developed. This is mostly open country. If we zoom in, we can see one of the reasons perhaps why Peter Carmichael was interested, because in the bottom left there, alongside the Dens Burn, is Dens Works, which of course was the base of Baxter Brothers. Now, Dens Works would expand considerably in the years after this map was made. It was already a big structure, but it kept growing. We can also see some other important Lost Dundee buildings. Now, if you look near the top, just to the middle right, you will see a large sprawling complex, and that was the original Dundee Asylum, which opened in 1820, became Dundee Royal Asylum, but eventually moved out to new premises at Liff as the city had grown up into that area and the asylum had become too small for its original purpose. So we got the new one at Liff, which survived until the 21st century. You can also, just to the top on the left, see the old Dundee East Poorhouse there, which is where the Dundee International Sports Centre is today. Here is what I think is one of the really interesting parts of the map. Now, the bit in green is a bit of a giveaway as to the ownership of this map, because that is Springfield, which was the home of Peter Carmichael. And you can see just along from it some other big houses, including Ellengowan, which was a Baxter property, and is where Mary Ann Baxter, the founder of University College Dundee, lived. Just to the north of that, there's nothing. But again, this was something that becomes significant within a few years, because on the north side of the Arbroath Road there, that land would become Baxter Park, which opened in 1863. Now, if you look down from Ellengowan, you'll notice that the bottom, between the railway and what we would now know as the Ferry Road, there are pools of water. And this is because if you look just below that, you can see the railway. And when the Dundee and Arbroath Railway was built and cut through here, it cut off the original shoreline. Now, much of this was being reclaimed, and eventually it would all be reclaimed for other buildings. But here we can see that in 1858 and into the 1860s, there were still stagnant pools of water there. Okay, so that's just a few of the quick highlights of what I think is a very interesting map, and shows just how Dundee has developed over the years. I hope you found that interesting. Stay safe, take care, and we'll talk again soon.